Okay, for this video, we're going to pick up where we left off at the end of non-specific resistance. We're going to talk about NK cells and fever and inflammation. So let's take a look at what those NK cells do. They do a process called immune surveillance. So basically, they are patrolling the body. They are on the lookout for pathogen and cells that are diseased, that have been infected by a virus or even cancer cells. When they find them, they are able to attack and destroy the bacteria, cells that have been infected with viruses, and even cancer cells. So the enemy cell is recognized, the natural killer cell binds to it and releases a protein that makes a hole in the membrane of the enemy cell, then releases enzymes that enter the enemy cell and that destroy the enzymes of the enemy cell, and then induce apoptosis, which is cell death. So let's take a picture of what that looks, or see a picture of what that looks like. So the NK cell is attaching to the enemy cell, releases those proteins that make a hole in the cell membrane, then release the enzymes. And once the apoptosis has occurred and the enemy cell has died, then the macrophage will come and engulf the dying cell. So when we see fever, we're pretty familiar with this. It's an abnormal elevation of the body temperature. It can come from quite a few different causes: trauma, infections, drug reactions. But it is an adaptive defense. So overall, a fever does more good than harm. You know, it makes us nervous a little bit, but really it is just the body defense against intruders. So it does promote interferon activity. Helps elevate the metabolic rate, and so that moves that blood around and increases the reaction rate, and that accelerates the repair of the tissue. It also stops the reproduction of bacteria and viruses, which is good. This talks about how the fever is initiated. Your book goes into the initiation, the middle part of the fever, and then the conclusion of the fever. I don't know that we need to go into that much detail. I will talk about Reye's syndrome for just a moment. It's a serious disorder in younger children following a viral infection like chickenpox or the flu. It has brain neurons swelling, and then that leads to pressure, and so they would exhibit symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, seizures possibly, and then 30% of them can die from this. So we would never want to use aspirin to control a fever with children that have chickenpox or flu-like symptoms. Okay, let's talk about inflammation. Inflammation is, we're still talking about a non-specific response. This is a local defensive response to a tissue injury of any kind. So that can include trauma, it can include infection. And so that inflammation limits the spread of pathogens. So it doesn't allow the pathogens to go to a new tissue, and then it also destroys them. It removes the debris of the damaged tissue and starts the tissue repair process. So there's 4 cardinal signs of inflammation. I'm going to talk about the words at the bottom. Those are Dr. Lynn's added words, but I'm not too worried about them. I think that the words on the left-hand side of the screen are easier to remember than what he added. But calor is heat, rubor is blush, tumor is swelling or getting larger, and then dolor means distress. So it's basically, I think this was his kind of way to remember. But for all of these 4 cardinal signs of inflammation, then as we go through, we're going to see them pop up in certain locations. So it doesn't mean you have to have all 4, but any one of them is a sign that inflammation is occurring. So heat is from hyperemia. We'll get to that in just a second. Redness, also due to hyperemia, and red blood cells that have left the capillaries and are in the tissues. Swelling, which is called edema. We've talked about increased fluid in the tissue. And then also pain. That pain comes from direct injury of the neurons. So let's take a look at this inflammation, and this talks about mobilization of defenses. So we've talked about what the defenses are, but they're mobilized in a short range kind of way. So in the endocrine system, we talk about hormones moving throughout the body and sending signals. Well, these chemicals that are listed here to help regulate inflammation, they are also kind of communicating, but only with their neighboring cell, or with one host cell. They're not long range by any means. So this says they act as a short range to the neighboring cells or the cell that secretes them. But their ability to communicate even with that neighboring cell is very important. So let's look at more about inflammation. So we would expect at the site of this pathogen that increased blood flow is going to occur, and that's called hyperemia. It can be produced by histamine, other proteins, from basophils, mast cells, and hyperemia, or that increased blood flow, helps remove the toxins and waste, and so then the site can start to repair more rapidly if all of the toxins have been removed. There's also other chemicals that are dilating the blood vessels that helps that hyperemia by having a larger vessel to go through, and it also increases capillary permeability, so the ability to diffuse into or out of the capillary. In this inflammation, fluid, leukocytes, and plasma protein are actually going to leave the bloodstream. So they need to be able to fit through those gaps in the capillary because they need to be brought to the site of this inflammation. Inflammation also prevents pathogens from spreading. So there's two methods here. The fibrinogen makes a sticky mesh that walls off the microbes so they cannot go anywhere, and then heparin prevents clotting. Those neutrophils are basically the main enemy of the bacteria. They are going to arrive and accumulate at the injury site within an hour. After leaving the bloodstream, they basically have a little mission to arrive at the injury site, and they have the help of chemotaxis, which is the attraction to chemicals to guide them to the injury site. So they kind of have someone leading them there, if you want to think about it that way. And they are the quickest to respond, those neutrophils, and they get there and they kill the bacteria by phagocytosis. Now that's a type of endocytosis where the neutrophil is basically able to just engulf the bacteria and digest it, break it apart. Monocytes then will arrive later in about 8 to 12 hours. They're going to be there to help with cleanup and repair of the tissue. Once they arrive, they will become macrophages, again still engulfing and destroying the bacteria, but can also engulf dead and dying neutrophils. So neutrophils that have just completed their job, then they are going to get engulfed by the monocytes, which are actually macrophages at this point. Edema does contribute to the tissue cleanup. The swelling compresses the veins, reduces drainage, and it forces open the valves of the lymphatic capillaries. That's helping the lymph to drain as well. The lymph is going to collect and remove any bacteria or dead cells much better than the capillaries. So, but larger cells can fit into the lymph vessel. Hyperemia, that increased blood flow, is also going to deliver oxygen, amino acids, and then other molecules that are necessary for protein synthesis. And basically that's going to help with the repair. These cells need to be able to make the proteins that they need. Increased heat is going to raise the metabolic rate, speed up mitosis and tissue repair. So we know if there's been some cells that have been damaged, we need new cells to replace them. And then pain helps us to limit the use of that body part so that body part has a chance to rest and heal.